The email arrived at 6:12
Is this
a.m.
real, James?
Doong expedition, private
I can't
finalization
believe
trip.
it.
We're going.
Their U.S.
We are.
partner
I am
wanted
not
one
certain
last
about
trust
this road
test
here.
before the
We've
mega
accounted
contract.
for it.
4
And the
days
waivers.
underground in the world's
Are we
largest
sure?
cave.
Yes, everything is
No
secure.
cameras, just relationship. But Nee was on the kitchen floor, hugging her stuffed orange,
Sundong? Yeah.
and the cave's
I told
age
you it
limit
would
was
come
18 plus.
through.
Mhm.
We're going.
Have you ever had to
We are
choose between
going.
opportunity and keeping your child
We have
close?
to leave, but you can't come with us.
Like
But
and
what about
subscribe.
She's only
2 hours
6. I
earlier,
know.
everything had felt
I don't know
safe
what to
and
do.
normal. Hello and welcome back. When the biggest opportunity of your life requires leaving your child behind, the hardest question isn't whether you can, it's whether you should. 2 hours earlier, the house had been running on pancakes and normal plans. Nai sat on the kitchen floor, hugging her stuffed orange and demanding fruit first, like she was the CEO of breakfast. Anna was at the table drawing care cards. James's mother folded laundry quietly, moving like she didn't want to disturb the peace they'd fought so hard to build. Then James's laptop chimed. He opened the email and went completely still. His face changed, not panic, but something heavier. Recognition that everything was about to shift. What is it?" his wife asked, reading his expression before reading the screen. James turned the laptop toward her. The subject line sat there like a test. In-person finalization plus private relationship trip. Vietnam. Sun Doong expedition. She stared at the words. Sun Doong. Like the cave? James nodded slowly. Our U.S. partner is already in Vietnam, he said. They want one private trip together before we sign the expansion contract. Because of that email, the kitchen suddenly felt smaller. James's mother's hands paused mid-fold when she heard the word expedition. Is it safe? She asked, voice small but direct. James read the key details out loud, not to himself, but to them, like he wanted it to be family information instead of secret business. Small group, strict rules, licensed guides, no media, no extra guests. He looked up. It's a limited expedition, only a small number allowed per trip. Controlled environment? His wife's first instinct was to say no. Not because she didn't love beautiful things, but because beautiful things could become a spotlight if you didn't protect them. Then Nai climbed into her lap, pressed her warm cheek against her shoulder, and sighed like she trusted the world completely. That trust made the decision harder, not easier. James looked at his wife carefully. We only do this if it stays private, he said. No filming, no family story, just relationship and respect. She nodded. And Nee stays protected, she replied. Always. So James typed a response right there at the table, fingers deliberate. We accept. Boundaries required. No family filming, no posting, private trip only. Confirm terms before we book travel. He hit send before doubt could rewrite it. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Agreed. See you in Quang Binh. Briefing starts Friday 9 a.m. That confirmation changed the air in the room. James's wife stood and walked to the window, staring at the garden like she was measuring what it would cost to leave it. 2 days, she whispered. Please, we have 2 days to prepare. Anna looked up from her drawing. Prepare for what? James crouched beside her. Mom and I have to go on a work trip, he said gently. A cave trip. It's important for hill fruits. Anna's face shifted, not upset yet, just processing. Can I come? James shook his head. Not this time. The cave is only for grown-ups, but Grandma will stay with you and Nye. Anna's crayon paused. How many days? 4, James said. Anna's eyes widened. 4 is a lot. James's wife knelt beside them. It is a lot, she admitted. But we'll call when we can, and we'll bring you something from the trip. Nye, oblivious, banged her stuffed orange on the floor and yelled, "Fruit!" Everyone laughed, but the laughter was thin, like it was covering worry instead of releasing it. Because of that worry, the next 2 days became a careful dance of preparation. James's wife packed light. Sturdy boots, rain gear, headlamp, the emergency pouch James's mother had given her months ago. James printed the expedition waiver and the signed boundary agreement from the U.S. partner. They reviewed the itinerary twice, checking weather, checking guides, checking exit points. James's mother watched them pack and finally said what she'd been holding back. "You're scared to leave them," she said softly. James's wife looked up, surprised by the directness. "Yes," she admitted. James's mother folded one of Nye's tiny shirts with careful hands. "I was scared every time James's father traveled," she said. "But fear doesn't protect them. Presence does. And I'll be present." That promise landed differently than it would have months ago. It felt earned, real. On Friday morning, they left before dawn. Nye was still asleep, curled around her stuffed orange. Anna woke just long enough to hug them at the door, her arms tight and small. "I'll come back fast," she whispered. James pressed his forehead to hers. "We will," he promised. So they drove to the airport carrying that promise like cargo. The flight to Doong was short, but felt long. Every kilometer adding distance between them and the girls. James's wife stared out the window, watching Vietnam's green landscape roll past below, and tried to convince herself this was worth it. When they landed in Quang Binh, the air was different, humid, thick, older. Green mountains pressed close like the land was holding its breath. Their driver took them through winding roads to the briefing lodge near Phong Ha Ke Bang National Park, where Son Doong sat deep in the protected core zone. The U.S. partner was already there waiting in the lodge courtyard. 2 people, not a team. A calm procurement lead and a quality director. Professional, polite, not loud. They shook James's hand first, then his wife's. Firm, respectful, like they understood Hill Fruits wasn't a cute story, but an operation. Then they surprised them in the most family way possible. The procurement lead pulled out a small package and handed it to James's wife. "For your daughters," he said. "We know they couldn't come." Inside were 2 tiny headlamps, one pink, one yellow, and a small pouch of kids' snacks. James's wife felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she said quietly. The quality director smiled. "We have kids too," he said. "We get it." That gesture shifted something. This wasn't just business anymore. It was respect meeting respect. Before they could talk further, the guide team called everyone into the briefing room. The room was small, functional, filled with maps and gear. The lead guide stood at the front, weathered face, steady voice, and didn't romanticize anything. He spoke like a safety manager. "Hao Sun Doong is a 4-day expedition," he said. 3 nights camping inside. He pointed at a route map on the wall. 17 kilometers trekking, 8 kilometers inside the cave. Mud, river crossings, rope sections, and a steep climb we call the Great Wall of Vietnam. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. This is level hard. You must be fit. You must listen. You must trust your team. Then he added one line that James's wife had been dreading. Age requirement is 18 and above for Son Doong. No exceptions. She looked down at her hands, relieved and guilty at the same time. Nai was safe at home, not because they'd chosen to leave her, but because the cave itself had made the choice. James reached over and squeezed her hand once. A quiet acknowledgement. We did the right thing. After the briefing, the group dispersed for gear checks. James and his wife walked outside with the U.S. partner to make their boundaries plain one final time, the way they always did. James said it calmly, no aggression. No filming of my family, no posting, no authentic content. This trip is private or we don't continue. The quality director nodded immediately. We agree, he said. We came because we want to understand how you operate under pressure, not how you look on camera. James's wife felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not trust yet, but the possibility of it. That afternoon, James's phone buzzed with a photo from his mother. Nai sleeping, peaceful, stuffed orange tucked under her chin. Below it, a short text. All safe. Anna made you a care card. Come back whole. James stared at the photo longer than necessary, then slid the phone into his waterproof case like he was storing oxygen for the descent. That photo of Nhi became the anchor James carried into the jungle. At dawn the next morning, he and his wife left the lodge with the U.S. partner and the expedition team. A small group by design, limited and controlled, the trailhead started gentle, then turned honest. Mud sucked at their boots. Vines caught shoulders. The air thickened with humidity until breathing felt like work. James's wife focused on her steps, one foot then the other. The way she'd learned to focus during the hardest packhouse nights. The procurement lead walked beside her for a stretch, voice low. You okay? She nodded, wiping sweat from her face. I'm okay, she said. Just thinking about my girls. He smiled faintly. That's the hardest part of any trip, he said. Leaving the people who make the work matter. Because of that shared understanding, the silence between them felt less like pressure and more like respect. They crossed a river, cold water up to their calves, rocks slick under boots, and climbed steep sections where roots became handholds. No one rushed. No one performed. It was just effort, honest and unglamorous. Then the cave entrance appeared like a mouth in the mountain. Air pushed out of it, cool, heavy, damp, like the earth was exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. James stopped at the threshold and looked back at his wife. She met his eyes and nodded once. Together, they stepped inside. The world became enormous. Not pretty enormous. Humbling enormous. The kind of space that made voices drop to whispers without being told. Walls rose taller than buildings. The sound of an underground river echoed from somewhere deep and invisible. Headlamps carved small circles of light in a darkness that felt older than anything they'd ever known. So they walked carefully, single file, following the guide's steady pace. The rock turned slick in places. Water dripped from formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. Every step required attention, not fear, just presence. At the first rest point, they sat on smooth boulders beside the river. The guide passed around water bottles and granola bars. No one talked much. The cave swallowed conversation and gave back only echoes. The quality director broke the silence. Voice quiet but clear. "This place doesn't care about our schedules," he said, almost to himself. James nodded. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." That honesty seemed to unlock something. The procurement lead set down his water bottle and looked at James directly. "Can I tell you something?" James met his eyes. "Go ahead." The man's face shifted. Less professional, more human. "My father taught me to control everything," he said. "Business, family, image. I almost lost my wife and kids doing that." He paused, staring at the cave floor. "When I watched you refuse the cameras back at the lodge, I realized you're building something rare. You're building a company that protects a home." Because of that confession, the air between them changed. James didn't brag. He didn't deflect. He just nodded once, accepting the weight of what had been said. James's wife looked at her husband in the dim headlamp glow and saw it clearly. This trip wasn't about tourism or contracts. It was about whether people could trust the way they lived. The guide stood, signaling it was time to move. "We camp 2 hours deeper," he said. "Then tomorrow, we climb." So they continued into the cave's heart. The path narrowed, then opened into chambers so vast their headlamps couldn't find the ceiling. Somewhere far above, small openings let in threads of daylight. Dolines, the guide called them, collapsed sections where jungle grew inside the cave like a secret garden. By nightfall, they reached the first camp area. Tents were already set up by the support team. Warm food appeared. Simple rice, vegetables, tea. The routines felt controlled, safe, professional. James sat beside his wife on a flat rock, shoulders tired, voice low. "Tomorrow they'll see how we handle the hardest climb," he said. She nodded, watching lantern light flicker against ancient stone. "And after we return, we finalize the deal," she whispered. James reached into his pocket and touched his waterproof case where Nye's photo lived. "We finalize it our way," he said. "No spotlight, no trade." That night, sleep came in pieces. The cave was never truly silent. Always the river, always dripping water. Always the sense of weight pressing down from above. But it wasn't threatening. It was grounding. At dawn, they woke to tea and the guide's calm instructions. "Today is the Great Wall," he said, pointing at the route map. 90 meters vertical, ropes and harnesses. You go slow. You trust your gear." The climb was everything he promised. Steep, muddy, relentless. James's wife's legs shook halfway up. Her hands ached from gripping rope. But she didn't stop. She thought about Anna's tight hug at the door. She thought about Nee's sleeping face in the photo. She thought about the shop, the pack house, the care cards, the quiet discipline they'd built brick by brick. So she climbed. At the top, hands pulled her over the edge. James first, then the procurement lead. She sat on solid ground, breathing hard, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not victory, confirmation. She could do hard things. She had been doing hard things. The quality director sat beside her, also breathing hard. "That," he said between breaths, "is the realest team building I've ever done." James's wife laughed. "Tired, genuine. No trust falls required," she said. They rested, ate, drank water, then the guide led them deeper still, into sections where the formations became surreal. Calcite curtains, crystal pools, stone towers that looked sculpted by something beyond time. At the deepest point, the guide stopped and turned off his headlamp. "Everyone off," he said. One by one, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Complete, absolute. The kind of dark that made eyelids irrelevant. James's wife reached for her husband's hand in the blackness. He found hers immediately and held tight. In that moment, with no light, no phone signal, no outside world, just breath and heartbeat and trust, she understood what this trip had really been testing. Not their ability to hike, not their ability to endure, their ability to hold on to what mattered when everything else disappeared. The guide turned his light back on. The world returned. They began the long walk back toward the surface. By the time they reached the cave entrance 2 days later, muscles sore and faces tired, James's satellite device finally caught signal. It blinked once. New message. James opened it, and his wife leaned close to read over his shoulder. "Draft contract ready. Sign window 72 hours after return. Terms locked as agreed. Congratulations." James looked at his wife. No panic, no rush. Just focus. "We go home first," he said quietly. "We see the girls. We rest. Then we decide." She nodded. "Home first," she agreed. "Always." They walked out of the cave into blinding sunlight. The jungle was loud with birds and insects and life. The air was hot and bright and immediate. James pulled out his phone. As soon as service returned, messages flooded in. But only one mattered. From his mother. "Girls safe. Nie asking when you come home. Anna made welcome back cards. Drive careful." James showed his wife. She smiled. Tired, real, complete. The procurement lead approached them as they packed gear into the van. "That was the hardest thing I've done in years," he admitted. "And the most clarifying." James shook his hand. "Thank you for respecting our boundaries," he said. The man's grip was firm. "Thank you for showing us what integrity looks like under pressure," he replied. "We'll see you at signing, on your terms." On the long drive back to the airport, James's wife stared out the window at Vietnam's green mountains rolling past. Her body ached. Her heart felt full. "We did it," she whispered. James reached over and squeezed her hand. "We did it without losing ourselves," he corrected. At home, 2 days later, Nye ran to the door before they even knocked, like she'd sensed them coming. "Mama! Dada!" she screamed, crashing into their legs. Anna appeared behind her, holding a stack of care cards. "You came back whole," she said solemnly, like she was checking a promise. James crouched and pulled both girls close. "We came back whole," he confirmed. That night, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, James and his wife sat at the kitchen table with the contract pulled up on the laptop. James's mother brought tea and sat with them, not hovering, just present. "It's a good deal," James said, scanning the terms one final time. His wife nodded. "It is," she agreed, "and we earned it the right way." James's finger hovered over the signature line. Then he looked at his wife. "Ready?" She smiled. "Ready." He signed. She co-signed. James's mother watched with quiet pride. Outside, the Hill Fruit's lights stayed on. Inside, their peace felt stronger. Not because the cave had changed them, but because it had confirmed what they already knew. They could go deep, they could climb high, but they would always come home. Have you ever done something hard just to prove to yourself you could? Sometimes the bravest journey isn't the one that takes you farthest. It's the one that brings you back to what matters most.